scriptures for today are Matthew 2 and John 1, 1 through 5. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all of Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for it has been written by the prophet, 'And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel.'" The Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go pay him homage." When they heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. Now, after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who were seeking the child's life are dead." When Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And after being warned in a dream, he went away to the district of Galilee. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophet might be fulfilled. He was called a Nazarene. And then John 1 through 5. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things come into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and in the darkness did not overcome it.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, not one thing came into being. Without him, not one thing came into being. And what has come into being in him was life. And the life was the light of all people. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. On Christmas Eve, we were gathered here together in this sanctuary for a simple and reflective service. We sang songs, we read scriptures that told the story of the coming of Jesus. We shared communion together, and we had a candlelight service. Now, the candlelight service is this beautiful time where we all stand in a circle around the edge of the sanctuary, and we turn down the overhead lights, and we slowly pass a flame from one candle to another. It's one of the most beautiful and moving things to slowly see the light in the room grow as the flame is passed from one person to the next. It's a simple yet meaningful act that reminds us how the light of Christ is passed from one person to the next until it brightens this whole dark world that we live in. To remind us of how we are passing the light of Christ to each other, each year after the lights go down, I walk up to the Advent wreath, and I take the flame from the white candle in the middle, which is the Christ candle, which symbolizes the light of Christ itself. This Christmas, after we had finished our communion service and everybody was in place around the sanctuary with their candles, and the lights were dimmed and Silent Night was already being played on the organ, I turned around and walked up to the altar to light my candle. And all of a sudden, my heart skipped a beat. I hadn't noticed it earlier in the night, and I don't know how it happened. But when I got to the altar, I saw that the flame on the Christ candle was out. The 4 other candles continued to burn brightly, but the light of the Christ candle was gone. And I know that it's just a candle, but for a split second, my heart skipped a beat, because in that instant, not only did it feel like the candle had gone out, but I had that feeling that the light of Christ itself had disappeared. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. I'll be honest with you, that preaching the story of the 3 kings, or the wise men, or the magi, this is actually one of the more challenging scriptures for me to preach. And the reason is because, on one hand, these 3 foreign visitors coming to bring gifts to the baby Jesus, this is an image that makes a nice part of the nativity scene at Christmas time. They fit nicely into the nativity set with the shepherds and the angel and Mary and Joseph and all of that. And yes, there is this whole set of messages that can be drawn out of this story of their visit to Jesus, with some deeper meanings about who they were, where they were coming from, even their gifts, the gold, the frankincense, and the myrrh, and what they might symbolize in the larger story of the Gospel of Matthew. There's this whole thing that we can talk about how the wise men are tied to the celebration of Epiphany. Today is Epiphany Sunday, which means the appearing. And specifically, in the Christian tradition, the Sunday of Epiphany is actually the Epiphany of the Gentiles. It's the appearing of Jesus to the Gentiles, or to the non-Jewish world. And the reason that the wise men are associated with Epiphany is because this holiday is because they were the first non-Jewish people to come and worship Jesus. Now, all of this stuff is worth talking about, and some years we do tell the parts of the story that focus on this. But the problem for me, at least as in the task of preaching, is that when we read this scripture, in order to make it all warm and fuzzy, we kind of have to stop the story halfway through. See, when we read the full story, what we find is that this story about the visit of 3 foreign kings to the baby Jesus is actually unavoidably intertwined with some horrific violence. And what's more, pretty quickly we can see that the story is not really even that much about these 3 foreign visitors, but rather it is about 2 different kings and the conflict between them. Really, this story is about King Herod and King Jesus, and it's a question of which king we are going to worship. The Magi, or the wise men, or the kings, well, they might be the part of the story that we focus on. But really, they're kind of peripheral characters in this story. They are people who happen to get caught up in the drama between the political leadership of Palestine and this new baby who is being proclaimed as the Messiah, which is ultimately seen as a direct threat to that political leadership. Basically, what happens here is that King Herod is in a position of power, and he likes that position of power, and all of a sudden a bunch of foreigners come in and say, hey, so we're here to worship the new king of the Jews. And by the way, you're not him. And Herod goes, say what now? What's this king that you're talking about? And he proceeds to freak out a little bit. Now, to understand why Herod is doing what he does, you should know a couple of things about this King Herod guy. About 160 years before Jesus lived, there was a big Jewish revolt led by a group called the Hasmoneans. Now, they were a successful revolt against the Syrians and the Greeks, who were the occupying and controlling powers of Israel at that time. After that revolt, the Hasmoneans established their own Jewish political control system of the region. The problem is that pretty quickly, there's some infighting. And at one point, there are two brothers who are vying or trying to get control over the throne of the Jewish people. The younger brother at one point declares himself king and high priest of the temple. At which point the older brother goes to the Roman Empire and says, hey, so would you help me kick my brother out of that position? And they say, sure, for a price. The problem is that all of a sudden, now you've got the Romans involved in this power structure. And from that point on, that's how the Romans get a series of somewhat Jewish leaders or kings into control over the Jewish people. Essentially, these are Jewish kings, but they're really puppets for the Roman Empire. Herod is one of these kings. He's a guy who is biologically half Jewish, and he's sort of in a position of Jewish leadership, but he's really also the face of the Roman Empire, right in their backyard. Now, politically speaking, Herod is actually a pretty shrewd guy. He does what he needs to do in order to keep the Romans happy, but he also tries to gain favor and approval from within the Jewish people. And he tries to do this by sinking tremendous amounts of money into rebuilding the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, which was a massive project. I mean, it's one that started a good 40 years before Jesus was born and continued on for another 50 or 60. Now, despite having a certain amount of power, Herod was also incredibly paranoid. He was skeptical of just about everyone, even those from within his own family. He was constantly worried about hanging on to his power, and he was obsessed with eliminating any possible threats to his power. This was also combined with the fact that he was an incredibly brutal guy, which wasn't that odd for leaders of that day, but in any case, he used violence as a weapon of control and intimidation, even if you were related to him. In fact, right at the end of his life, Herod wound up having two of his sons and his favorite wife killed because he thought that they were a threat to his power. This is the kind of guy we're talking about. And so here come three foreigners showing up on his doorstep, bringing gifts to honor the new king of the Jews, which is his title, that they had heard about. Now, King Herod has not heard anything about this new king, who would clearly be a threat to his power, which explains why he would send off the wise men to find Jesus with this completely disingenuous statement saying, oh, well, yeah, I'd like to come and worship him too. Yeah, right. Immediately he goes to the priests after the kings have left, and the priests who should have warned him about this, he goes to them and he says, hey, what's going on here? And sure enough, they go back through the scriptural text and they confirm what these foreigners were claiming about a new king. Now, this also explains why the three wise men don't come back to Herod. Or at least when the wise men don't come back to Herod, it also explains why he figures out that he's been tricked And then he sends out an order to kill every male child or every child under the age of 2 in this particular village. It's a massacre that turns Jesus into a refugee who flees to Egypt to escape the political violence that was aimed at his family. It's also an event which, interestingly, doesn't have a lot of historical evidence outside of the Bible itself, but it is certainly within keeping of the kind of thing that Herod would do. This makes sense for Herod. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Herod was a king who ruled this region by trying to please the Roman Empire and the local Jewish population. He tried to gain favor with people through displays of wealth. He was paranoid about keeping his power, and he was willing to do horrific things to anybody and everybody in order to keep hold of that power. This is the kind of king that Herod was. And he was right about one thing. He was right that Jesus was also a king, and that Jesus was also most certainly a threat to Herod. Not because Jesus wanted to take away his particular political power, but because Jesus was a different kind of king. A king who exposed the evil of this world for what it is. If King Herod was a rich, powerful, well-connected, paranoid, brutal king, Jesus was a poor, vulnerable, unknown, loving, and gentle king. You might say if Herod is the hurricane, Jesus is the candle standing in the middle of the eye of the storm. They are both kings, but they are completely different types of kings. And the truth is you can't worship both of them. You cannot worship King Herod and King Jesus at the same time, which is exactly what the Magi figured out. It was revealed to the Magi in a dream what King Herod was up to, and they knew that Jesus was really the kind of king that they wanted to be associated with and not Herod, and so they found a different way to get back home. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Now here's the thing about this story, and at least figuring out what it means for our world today. When we read this story and ask the question of who might line up in our world with King Herod or King Jesus in our modern world, well, there's some pretty low-hanging fruit here. It's not particularly hard for me to make really direct connections between the kind of things that King Herod did and the kinds of things that leaders in our world, and I mean globally, still do today. And the main reason for this is, well, that when you look at the last 2,000 years of history, more often than not, leaders of this world look more like Herod than they do Jesus. And that's true for ones that I like and I've voted for. King Herod shows up more often than we want to admit. And yes, there is a trueness that we need to name the evil that is done by powerful people. Because part of that naming shines a light on it that helps stop it from happening. It's also true that there are all kinds of political leaders that do horrible things both here in this world, or here in our country and around the world. And we can't worship both the type of king that Herod might align with and still worship the Jesus of the manger. There are many horrific things that need to be named and called out, but my guess is you don't really need me to do that. My guess is you don't need me to stand up here and name all of those different things. I would guess that you've got your own list of evil in this world that feels overwhelming and soul-crushing. The line from the Gospel of John is that the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. But my guess is that you might already feel like I did at that moment at Christmas Eve, where I turned to find the Christ candle had gone out. There are times that we don't need to be reminded of the darkness, because actually it feels like the darkness may have won. See, today is Epiphany Sunday. It's the Sunday where we celebrate that the light of the world was born into this world. We celebrate the light shining and giving hope to all who can see it. Today, we are not celebrating the darkness, even if that darkness feels overwhelming. And so the question today is not how do we name the darkness that's too easy to see. The question for today is how do we hang on to that light? Or how do we find the light in the middle of that darkness? And to do that, I think there are two things to remember. The first of which is that the light of Christ comes into this world not in spite of the darkness, but because of it. And what's more, the light comes as the opposite of the darkness. And that's what makes it powerful. It is precisely because Jesus was born in obscurity, in poverty, in vulnerability, that he is able to challenge the dark powers of violence and power of his day and of ours. And even when those dark powers think that they have won, the light of Christ still shines through. Even when Jesus finds himself crucified and dying at the hands of the power of violence itself, that's when God says, no, the story is not over. The light comes back into the world. Even when the darkness tried its hardest to overcome the light of the world, the light still shines in the darkness. Which means that the light of Christ is still shining in our world too. Although, yes, it is true that sometimes we lose sight of that light. Which is where we need to remember the second thing. Which is that when our flame goes out, we can relight that flame from someone else. On Christmas Eve, when I noticed that the Christ candle had gone out, I simply took a flame with my small candle from one of the others and relit the light of Christ. At which point I could then take that and pass it around again to everyone else in the room. I think the truth for today is something similar to that as well. There are times where it might feel like our candle has gone out, or that the light of Christ is missing. But the truth is that when that original light of Christ came into the world thousands of years ago, it began to spread. It spread to others. It spread through the disciples and the early Christians and on and on. For thousands of years, through millions of people, that light of Christ has been passed around this world. And that same light still burns in each of our hearts. And yes, there are times where the forces of darkness have tried to snuff out those lights, but the darkness has never completely snuffed out that light of Christ. Which means that even though we might find ourselves overcome by the darkness in any given situation or time, the way to rekindle that light is to come together with other followers of Jesus, to share that fire once again. It's by coming together and sharing our lights with each other, reminding ourselves of the hope of Christ that is still at work in us and through us, that we can relight our own light. And it is at that point that, yes, we can say the light shines in the darkness. And truly, the darkness has not and will not overcome it. Amen.
Thanks for watching this video from the First Church of the Brethren in Wichita, Kansas. If you'd like to watch another video, click the link on the right. Thanks for liking, commenting, and subscribing on this video. And we'd love to have you join us on Sundays at 9:30 for Sunday school and 10:45 for worship. Everyone is welcome and you're invited.